A little bit different.
Hey guys, this is the final episode of the Unbeatable Podcast. And my guest today is the classic example of what I've tried to do with this podcast. His name is Mark Clookie, and this guy's commitment to our country, his service all over the world, his actions in the Pentagon on September 11th, 2001, all of those things alone are reasons why he's the perfect guest to end this podcast with. But not only did he serve for 31 years and make it all the way to director of NCIS, but he was so well respected that even the television show NCIS said, "Mark, we want you to be on the show. We want you to play yourself on the show." And I get a chance to talk to Mark about portraying himself on a television show, which I don't think I've ever heard of another person getting that opportunity to do. But Mark is the perfect guest because he's now spending the rest of his life with all of those amazing skills that he's developed, using it to try to help people. So let me tell you about this podcast before we get into the interview with Mark. I originally set out 3 years ago to create a podcast that would encourage people, that would challenge people. We use the name Unbeatable because I am convinced everybody, it doesn't matter what walk of life you're in, everybody is going to go through hard times. We're all going to get punched in the face by life. There's no way to prevent it. But there are two different responses once you get punched in the face by life. You can stay down on the ground and you can feel sorry for yourself and you can lick your wounds and you can complain about how unfair life is. And it is unfair and it hurts to get punched in the face by life. Or you can be the second type of person, the person who picks themselves up and dusts themselves off and says, "Wow, that hurt. And I don't ever want to go through something like that again. But I am not going to let circumstances beat me." So the very name Unbeatable infers that you have had something rough happen to you, maybe repeatedly happen to you, but you refuse to let those defeat you. So Unbeatable means I've been hit and it's hurt, but I will not let it beat me. And over the course of the last 3 years, we've had a chance to talk to Olympic gold medalists and military athletes. We've had a chance to talk with movie stars and with musicians. We've had a chance to talk with lots of people that have had illustrious careers in the military. But I've tried to make this podcast 30 or 40% well-known names and 60 to 70% regular people. And I'm talking about people that have gone through divorce. They've gone through the death of a family member. They've gone through disease. They've gone through circumstances that they had absolutely nothing to do with and wouldn't wish on their worst enemy. And they refused to let those circumstances defeat them. They brushed themselves off and chose to be unbeatable. But now I'm going to let you in on the secret. I originally started this podcast so that I could influence people at the soul level. I want you to hear inspiring stories. I want you to hear people that faced adversity and regular, everyday people just like you who were able to face the adversity and keep going so that when you face adversity, you would keep going. But I really wanted to introduce you just subtly and naturally to people that have something deeper inside them than just willpower. Some steel rebar inside them of a strong, passionate faith in God who gives them the ability to handle circumstances that most other people would just simply be overwhelmed by. And we've never tried to run it down your throat, but I've just tried to honestly show you this is what real faith in God looks like. When Jesus Christ is the center of your life and you go through crises, you have somebody who, to quote the Bible, walks with you in the valley of the shadow of death. And because he's with you, you have no reason to fear evil. Mark is one of those guys. And Mark becomes the perfect guest to wrap up this entire podcast with. I've been hinting for the last several weeks that I am replacing the podcast, and I really believe we're going to do something bigger and something better. So starting next week, I want you to go ahead and search on Apple TV. If you have Amazon Fire or if you use Roku as a streaming service, I want you to go ahead and search for Jeff Strucker Ministries, and you'll find my TV channel. And in that TV channel, we will start uploading new content every week. And that content is designed to strengthen and support you at the soul level. So I'm not actually going away. I'm transitioning to television. You can, of course, stay connected with us on YouTube because we will drop episodes each week on YouTube as well. But the way to stay connected with us is by mobile app or a television app through Apple TV, Roku, and Amazon. So why don't you go ahead and search on Google Play or Apple or the Apple App Store for Jeff Strucker Ministries, and why don't you go ahead and download that app as well. The content for the television channel will show up each week on that app, but you'll also continue to get articles from me. I'll stay in touch with you. In fact, I will communicate more regularly through that mobile app and than I have been through this podcast. The Unbeatable Army continues. And in fact, I believe the Unbeatable Army will be stronger and better through Jeff Strucker Ministries than it ever was through the Unbeatable Podcast. So if you're already part of the Unbeatable Army, you can expect to continue to get content from me each week delivered straight to your inbox. And if you're not part of the Unbeatable Army, why don't you go ahead and sign up, because it's totally free and I'll stay connected with you by email. Just go over to unbeatablearmy.com. This is a much longer than normal introduction, because I want you to understand why we selected Mark Clookie as the final guest for the Unbeatable Podcast. Now I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to bring Mark in, and we're going to have our grand finale episode of Unbeatable. Thank you for being so faithful and listening with me. Now, here's my interview with Mark.
These stories of triumph over adversity will help you handle your toughest days in life and become unbeatable.
Hey, Mark, welcome to the last official episode of the Unbeatable Podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm honored to be a part of it. Thank you.
Man, I have been looking forward to talking to you for some time. Literally, I've been spending about a year looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad we finally made it happen.
There's a lot about your background and my background that line up, but I just got to say, man, I am a huge fan. I am fascinated by a guy who is so well known in the community that he actually played himself on television. Like, that right there is really, really cool, man.
Yeah, it was an awesome opportunity. I appreciate that.
Yeah, so for all of the folks out there who are familiar with NCIS and the many spin-off television shows from that very successful TV franchise, Mark is the guy who lived it, and he lived it so well that he actually played himself on television, which I don't know of another person that has that claim to fame, man. You might be the only person I've ever heard of who's actually played themselves on television.
Well, it was a great experience, and I'm always happy to represent that agency, which I am so proud of and honored to have been a part of.
You spent a long time doing it, and you got a chance to do it all over the world, man. Let's talk a little bit about how you ended up in NCIS and then describe for us some of your career.
Sure. Yeah. Well, both of my brothers were federal agents at one point in time. My eldest brother, Coast Guard Intelligence, Coast Guard Investigative Service. My middle brother was an NIS agent, NIS being the predecessor to NCIS. And they were just a huge influence on me. So went to the University of Maryland, College Park, studied criminal justice and law enforcement. Tried to get into NIS initially, and then they said, no, you need some worldly experience. So I became an Annapolis City police officer in Annapolis, Maryland.
Oh, great city. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Served there 2 years, and NCIS then decided that they were going to take in their words, we'll take a chance on you.
Take a risk with you.
Yeah.
All right. If your brothers were old, I'm assuming your brothers were older and they were already doing this, and that's one of the reasons why you started looking down this route.
That's right. Exactly.
You had a brother that went to the Coast Guard. I didn't even know the Coast Guard had their own investigative services.
They do. It's a great service. I love the Coast Guard. Actually,
I do too. I've said for years, nobody does more real world stuff in the entire U.S. Government than the Coast Guard does.
Every day.
Yep.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
How did your brother find out about this?
I'm sorry?
I was going to ask how your brother found out about the Coast Guard service, the Coast Guard branch.
It turns out that our father was a Coast Guard warrant officer and group commander up in Two Rivers, Wisconsin, which is where I was born. So Coast Guard flows in my veins. And Woody, my eldest brother, became a Coast Guard sailor, and then eventually went into CGIS, Coast Guard Investigative Service. And then he influenced our middle brother, Wayne, who eventually became an NIS. Back then it was NIS, Naval Investigative Service agent. And the legacy continues. In fact, my eldest daughter is an NCIS.
What? Look at that. Your mother, I'm trying to figure this out. So your mother is married to someone and 3 sons serving in the same kind of career. You guys come from a military dynasty is what you're telling me.
Yes, of sorts, yes.
This is back in the day before NCIS was a thing. Like, I don't want to use this phrase, but before NCIS was cool, before it became a television show. So you started, take us all the way back to when you started after leaving the Annapolis Police Force.
1st of March, 1982, joined NCIS in Newport, Rhode Island as a rookie, brand new special agent, the kind of guy that Jethro Gibbs would have knocked on the back of the head.
All right.
So 5 years in Newport, and then came to our headquarters in Suitland, Maryland at that point. Where I worked on fraud cases and that sort of thing. And then had my first opportunity to go to the Middle East, where I was stationed in Bahrain, Manama, Bahrain, a beautiful little island in the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
And served there as the resident agent in charge.
I made a quick stop or two there going overseas, a time or two on my way in and out of combat theaters. I know what this country's like. But most people have never even, there's people listening right now that have never even heard the word. No. So you got to tell them a little bit about what duty was like there.
Bahrain is a very small island, actually, right off the coast of Saudi Arabia in the Persian Gulf. Tight-knit community. Originally, the base was a British-held base, but later became a U.S. naval installation. And it was a small community at that point. My office was only myself and 5 or 6 other agents and a secretary and a yeoman, Navy yeoman. And then, but we covered all of the Middle East to include Southwest Asia and East Africa. So we had
You covered all of that area from that little island?
Yes, absolutely.
Wow, you must have spent some time on aircraft hopping in and out of there, bouncing all over the world.
A lot of aircraft. In fact, it was during that time in the early 90s that I visited a country and city that you're very familiar with, Mogadishu, Somalia.
Okay.
I was only there briefly and wasn't involved in any firefights, thank goodness. So I don't have that experience.
I just learned this like 2 minutes before we started recording that you were over there, but you said you were there early 90s. So when exactly were you in Somalia?
That would have been, I don't remember the month, Jeff, but it would have been probably mid 1993.
Okay. Yeah.
I was responsible as the agent in charge of the NCIS office there. I was also responsible for the executive security of Admiral Katz, Doug Katz,
Oh, man.
who's the head of the Navy in the Middle East, basically. So he wanted to go to Mogadishu and visit all the troops there, and just give them a word of encouragement and so forth. So it was my responsibility to make sure he got in and out safely. So flew in there once to pre-plan the trip, and then a second time to actually bring the admiral in and out.
Well, I'm impressed, and I'll make sure that the listeners understand. The United States and the United Nations showed up to Somalia in this relief effort in December of '92. And then it was largely a United States Marine operation for about 6 months. And I distinctly remember while the Marines were over there, man, the United States was doing great. After the Marines left, they were replaced by U.S. Army forces and some Air Force. And this would have been while you were over, the Marines would have still been over there while you were there. That makes total sense that you would have been there on that executive security detail. But the Somali warlords all said publicly, like, hey, we respected the Marines. We didn't want to mess with the Marines. So we stayed, we stayed, calm during the time that the Marines were there. But after the Marines left, then they just started to get a little bit wild and rowdy, and it just went downhill after that. So it was really, no matter what time you were there, though, I mean, it was kind of a extremely dangerous city just because of the lawlessness over there. So I didn't realize that you and I shared the fact that we were both in Somalia in '93. Interesting.
Indeed. Yeah.
After Somalia, what's next for your career?
So from Bahrain, let's see, I have to think through this because in my 31 years with NCIS, I was transferred 11 times.
You just heard him, 31 years and 11 moves.
Yeah. So from Bahrain back to headquarters to New Jersey, actually, where I was the assistant special agent in charge of NCIS operations in the northeast of the U.S.
Oh, you had all of the northeastern states.
Yes.
You end up spending a little bit of time over in Okinawa as well, because this is a huge marine and naval installation for the United States military.
Exactly. So from New Jersey, we transferred to Okinawa, Japan, and spent 2 years there. Loved every minute of it. The Japanese people are wonderful people. We loved them dearly, and they were good to us. You're right. It's a huge U.S. Marine Corps population there, multiple bases. U.S. Navy was there, ran the hospital for all U.S. troops. But we actually, oddly enough, we actually lived on the Kadena Air Force Base.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, we loved it so much, I asked for an extension, but of course, my headquarters had better ideas. And you know how that goes.
Yeah.
You come back. So I was transferred back to our headquarters.
Almost every career Marine that I know has been to Okinawa more than once. You stay around the United States Marine Corps long enough, you're going to be stationed in Japan and in Okinawa. So I've never been there, but I've heard so many stories about how amazing the Japanese people are, how awesome Okinawa, the island of Okinawa is. Before we get into the rest of your career, I think there's a lot of people. I've never really, I'm going to admit this out loud, but I've never really watched an episode of NCIS, so I don't really know what goes on in the television show. But I do know this: the fact that it has spun off so many different versions of that show, it must be wildly successful. But I want people who are listening, who are familiar with the television show, to hear from you. Like, what's it like being an NCIS special agent? Is it like the TV show, or is it different?
It's different. I love my career. I feel so blessed that God put me in that career, ultimately. The show is great, and it's very entertaining. We do investigate homicides, but it seems like the television series is all about.
Somebody's getting killed every day on the television show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So our mission was much more broad in investigating all levels of felony crimes, or all types of felony crimes, I should say, to include doing counterterrorism operations, counterintelligence operations, counterespionage, counter-trafficking, even counter-piracy operations, working jointly with the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps.
Really, you have counter-piracy operations in NCIS as well.
NCIS would support the Navy, particularly the Fifth Fleet, which operates out of Manama, Bahrain, covering the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean,
and of course, all of those Somali, pirate,
absolutely,
issues that have gone on in the last 10 or 12 years or so.
Exactly. Yeah. So the mission is much more broad than the television show would have you believe.
Which makes it sound like you're extremely busy as a special agent in the NCIS, with that much of a mission. You'd spent more than a little bit of time in Washington, D.C., and in what's referred to as the military district of Washington, D.C., just all of the massive amount of military forces there. I've never been stationed there. I've actually never stepped foot into the United States Pentagon. Don't ever plan to step foot in there. But I have seen extremely high-ranking leaders in Washington, D.C. Anywhere else, they would be treated like royalty. In Washington, D.C., they're basically doing the job of a private because there's so many high-ranking people in one place at one time. I'd love to know what it was like to be stationed in Washington, D.C., and you had some pretty impressive assignments while you were there.
Long days and long evenings. The pressure's on, the stress is on, and you should be thankful you didn't have an assignment in the Pentagon.
I am. I've heard from plenty of people that were there, and they've all said the same thing you're saying right now.
Yeah, it's a pressure cooker for sure. And it's because there's so much going on. And of course, as you know, our military services work quite well together. And there's a great deal of exchange of not just information, but intelligence, joint training that has to be planned. There's joint exercises, so forth and so on. And that's, the Pentagon, that's where it all comes together, right? That's where all the heads of all the services come together and develop strategies and budgets and so forth. And you can imagine all those dollars, all those people, all those missions having to be coordinated. The Pentagon is a magical place.
For many years, it was the world's largest office building, and it still contains horsepower. And I'm using this phrase on purpose. Unlike any place else on planet Earth. My first experience in Washington, D.C., I was a sergeant in the Ranger Regiment. I went up there to put on a display for Congress, and there were some field-grade officers from the Pentagon who came right before the congressional leaders, came through the display, the Ranger Regiment's capabilities. And I watched some of these very senior field-grade officers, lieutenant colonels and colonels, who were very much acting like being treated like privates in a Ranger battalion. And that was my first, couple of years in the Army. And that was the moment that I said, if I avoid the Pentagon and Washington, D.C. for the rest of my career, I'll be entirely happy. Yes. And it took some work, but that's exactly what I did.
That's right. Yeah. Good on you.
You had some pretty impressive roles while you were in Washington, D.C. And so can you describe, the multiple roles that you had there?
Sure. Well, coming out of Okinawa, I was transferred to our NCIS headquarters, which is at that point was at the Washington Navy Yard downtown. Mm-hmm. And I was in charge of all of our human resources, training and that sort of thing. And it was during that time that a vacancy developed in a sister organization, the Defense Intelligence Agency. Well, I was seconded to DIA as the NCIS representative to work in the counterintelligence support branch for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And so, yeah, our effort, it was a joint, again, this is where the magic happens, right? The Army, the Navy, Air Force all comes together to provide counterintelligence support to the J2, which is the intelligence office, if you will, for the joint staff, the chairman and his staff, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So that was that role. And I was there only briefly before 9/11, just a few weeks.
Yeah. I want to make sure that the listener hears this. So, because you've spent so much time at this point in the Middle East, North Africa, and in kind of the hot spots of terrorism, and then you get sent to and start working with the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Joint Staff, obviously you're not just a guy who's reading the reports, but you're a guy who's been on the ground and really knows what you're talking about. And if I did my research correctly, you get sent to the Pentagon and start working in the Pentagon in August of 2001. Is that right?
That's right.
Today is the 12th of September. It is the day after the anniversary of the attacks of September 11th, and you're in the Pentagon. And most people around the world know it wasn't just the World Trade Centers in New York City. It was also a field in Pennsylvania, and a plane flew right into one of the sides of the Pentagon and killed a lot of people in that building. Can you describe September 11, 2001 personally? What was it like for you?
Yeah. Commuted to the Pentagon via the subway system, which had a station in the basement.
Right in the Pentagon, yeah.
Pentagon. Went up to my office, which was in the E ring, the outermost ring of the Pentagon, first floor.
I want to pause and just say, for the listeners around the world, the Pentagon has 5 sides, 5 rings, and the outside ring is the ring that was hit by the United Airlines flight or American flight, whatever.
That's right. Yeah.
Go ahead.
That's where it hit. Came in about one wedge over from where my office was. There's, in addition to your description, there's 5 wedges of the Pentagon. So I was on the first floor, and a very bright analyst that was attached to my office, the counterintelligence support branch for the Joint Chiefs, came hurrying into the office. And whenever you see somebody hurrying
in the Pentagon,
it's not good.
It's not good. Yeah, I was going to say, you don't even have to tell me that. If somebody's running in the Pentagon, it's bad.
It's not done. Yeah, absolutely. So this young man, very bright guy, came to me and said, boss, we've got a problem. I asked him what it was. He said, well, a plane has hit the World Trade Center in New York City. And I said, well, Gene, is it a problem of weather? Did the plane fail? What do we know about it? And he said, boss, it's a bigger deal than that. And I said, okay. So our office had a more secure office in the basement. And by secure, I mean it was a special compartmented intelligence facility, a SCIF.
It was a vault down in the basement.
In the basement of the Pentagon. So he asked me to join him. I went down into our office in the basement, and wasn't very long after that, the second plane hit the second tower of the World Trade Center. And of course, my entire staff assembled immediately. We started developing strategies. What are we going to provide? What can we provide to the Joint Chiefs in the way of information and intelligence that may have led up to this? And it seemed like a very short time when we heard the alarms of the Pentagon going off. Now, mind you, we were so well secured in that basement vault, as you call it, Jeff. We heard nothing, felt nothing, saw nothing. And it wasn't until we were actually up a few levels and walking through the corridors that we saw people running in an opposite direction. Very brave young men and women, that we realized there's got to be something going on here bigger than just some routine alarm going off or some sort of a practice exercise or whatever. And then, of course, we went out our designated exit of the Pentagon, and the black smoke was, you see that billowing overhead, and realized that we probably were hit as well. And we went to our muster point, and thank God, all of my staff was accounted.
Yeah. I want to make sure people, and I'm going to be very delicate about this, and we're going to dance around this. You're at this point part of the national intelligence apparatus. There's already been, some deliberate attacks against the United States at this point. The bombing of the basement of the World Trade Centers, the bombing of the USS Cole. If I remember right, there's already been attacks on U.S. embassies before this. And you're part of the national intelligence apparatus that is supposed to be giving information to the Joint Chiefs, who are also feeding information to the president. And when something like this happens, the first plane hits, of course, the news is scratching their head trying to figure out what went wrong. But in your office, people already are saying, I don't think this was pilot error. This definitely wasn't weather. This was probably deliberate before anybody else is realizing it's deliberate. I'm using this description because not only do you have to keep your staff healthy and safe, but you also have a job to do, a extremely important job to do right now. Like, everybody in the world is depending on intelligence to figure out what's going on, and you're part of that intelligence arm. I would love for you to describe as as generically as possible your responsibilities to the joint staff at this point, and that, providing information up the chain to the president.
Right. Well, to keep them informed, we have to maintain our comms, our communication system, the inflow of intelligence from the multiple sources that we depended upon. All the three-letter agencies that everyone's familiar with, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, NSA, and so forth. And of course, we can no longer operate out of our existing facility. So once we reached our muster point, the place where we were supposed to collect as a group so I could account for everybody. And mind you, I'm in this job now maybe 3 weeks.
I was going to say, you just showed up in August. This is September 11th, which means you've only been there for less than a month.
Right. And my staff had to tell me where the muster point was.
Of course.
So I'm basically following them to where we're supposed to be. And I immediately turned to my staff and I said, there has got to be a coup, a continuation of operations. What is it? Where are we going? How do we get there? And I can't disclose the location, but it was within a long walk. Let me say that.
All right.
A long walk. And all the roads surrounding the Pentagon were shut down.
Yeah, sure.
And the subway system was closed. Everything just came to a standstill. And cell phones were not working. The system was overwhelmed. So try not to give away too much here. We ended up walking, part of our way, we walked over literally the graves in Arlington National Cemetery. And it was one of the most poignant times I've ever experienced, to be walking across the graves of fallen heroes and look back at the Pentagon and see it on fire.
I'm getting the hair on the back of my neck is standing up, because I've got this image of fire trucks and sirens and ambulances screaming towards the Pentagon as you're walking over the graves of Arlington National Cemetery, knowing we're about to put more bodies in that ground pretty soon. And I don't mean the upcoming war. I mean just pulling the people out of the attack. Yeah,
absolutely.
Wow.
And unfortunately, well, any loss is a big loss. Of course, the Navy, I think, suffered probably the largest body in that instance. So anyhow, we made it after a long walk to another facility that was secret to everybody, basically. And we were able to stand up our communication links and begin sharing information again with our sister agencies and trying to our best to provide the Joint Chiefs with information they needed to have.
Yeah, I thank you for sharing that, by the way. I ask that for the listener because I want them to hear you don't know who's dead, who's wounded, who's alive in the Pentagon, but you have a job to do. And your job right now is to not focus on the bodies in that burning building. Your job is to focus on, I owe the Joint Chiefs some information. They owe that information up the chain to the president. And I've got to do my job in spite of the chaos of the air networks, the cell phone networks, the public transportation networks. I was driving into work the morning of September 11th, and this is in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, one of the largest military bases in the world, and every road going in literally shut down for about 12 hours, and people just locked the doors of their car on the interstate and walked to work because there was no getting in or getting out any other way. But I'm saying they didn't go home and watch television. They all had a job to do. So I've got to figure out how I'm going to get to my place of work and do my job in spite of the chaos of September 11th. If I'm correct, you didn't spend much time in Washington, D.C. after the attacks and were quickly sent somewhere else. So can you describe what happens next?
Yes. So I did spend a little bit of time trying to help get my team at that point, reestablished and so forth. And then an opportunity came up. My headquarters contacted me and they said, given your previous experience in the Middle East, as the resident agent in charge of a small office, we're anticipating a large buildup in the Middle East. Would you take that role and build that office up to what it needs to be? And I said, absolutely. Put me on the next plane. Get me out there. I wanted some paybacks, to be frank.
Yeah, sure. Of course. Obviously, anybody who's listening right now who knows the timeline knows that we go from just a few thousand people over in the Middle East to the next 20 years with several tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people over there, which means your role, the role of NCIS in the Middle East, just became the epicenter of, the force for about the next 20 years. And it sounds like you're the guy who's going to go back there and stand up the force that they need in the Middle East.
At least for the NCIS perspective, if I recall correctly, I think we grew the office to about 130 personnel.
From about 5 or 8 to 130, just a little bit of growth.
Yeah, we had to build buildings, literally, not with our own hands, fortunately. And those agents were spread out throughout South Asia, Africa, and what most people recognize as the Middle East.
But I want to make sure that the listeners know this isn't just Afghanistan or Iraq right now. I mean, we're talking about 50 places around the world that are potential hotspots, and your office has to be aware of all of them and have a contingency for all of those. I mean, what happens immediately after the attacks on September 11th stretched the force, the entire U.S. military force in ways that's unheard of.
Well, you think that 130 personnel out of the NCIS office there, we weren't all stationed at that one office. Most were spread out. We were covering 26 countries in that region. So that tells you, even with 130 personnel, we were stretched thin.
Yeah, very thin. Sure. Take us through the rest of your career, because I cannot wait for people to hear. You're so well known that during the NCIS television series, somebody says, hey, we want a guy who will play Special Agent Mark Clookie in this series. Why don't we just use Mark to play himself in this series? He's that well known. So can you take us through the rest of your career?
Sure. Well, after Bahrain and my time in the Middle East there, we came back to our headquarters, and I spent some of my time running our counterterrorism operations out of the headquarters.
Which, if I can interrupt, this becomes kind of the focus, everybody's number one focus at this point, right? Counterterrorism.
Right. And we were flush with money.
Yeah.
So we could be very strategic in designing and developing programs and operations that would better protect U.S. Marine Corps and Navy assets. Yeah. And those assets, everybody thinks, well, okay, you're protecting ships and planes and so forth. We're protecting sailors and Marines, but we're also protecting their families. And I think that's lost on a lot of people. If you have not served in the military, you may not appreciate just how much our families sacrifice. Like my family, and I'm just one of millions. 11 transfers in 31 years. That means kids being uprooted from schools, spouses being put into living conditions that they had never dreamed about, both good and bad. So we felt a very heavy responsibility to not only protect true, actual Department of Navy assets, but also the families that came with it.
Yeah, and I should say, every time I've had somebody who served the country on this podcast, I've always said thank you. And I want to extend the same thing to you, Mark, for your incredible service to our country. But I have very publicly said many times, I am convinced the hidden heroes of our country are the military families. They don't get thanked, but you and I both know there's no way our country's military force could do what they do without the family. And the life of a military family is absolutely brutal, and no one really understands it except the folks that have been there. So thank God you and your team are putting real resources into protecting the families, not just the guys and gals in uniform.
No, that's right. It's one big family, as you know.
I've always said, you lose the family, you lose the warrior, and there's not enough that we can do to say thank you to the families. There's really not enough for people of the United States.
You're absolutely right.
Walk us through the rest of your career, will you?
So different assignments within the headquarters element there at the Washington Navy Yard still. And ultimately, I was coming down to a point. I don't know if probably most of your listeners are not aware that federal agents have a shelf life.
Yeah.
And you must retire.
Just like the military, there's a shelf life and there's a mandatory retirement date. When you hit that point, it takes an act of Congress, literally, to keep you in uniform after that date.
That's right. So I'm at this point, maybe in my early 50s. I'm thinking 52, somewhere around that age. And I'm starting to think about retirement. Life is good, and I'm enjoying my time. And our current director decides that it's time for him to move on. So he announces his retirement. My boss at that time, one of our deputy directors for NCIS, approaches and said, "Hey, I'd like you to put in an application for the directorship." A thought that had never crossed my mind, wow. Really, honestly.
Just to hear that from your boss, what an incredible compliment.
And it was humbling because I have to immediately reflect, like, well, I'm not capable of being the director of NCIS. I really did not feel that at all, honestly. So it was a little alarming. I appreciated the fact that he thought that I would be a suitable candidate. And I put in the application, went through a series of interviews at the Pentagon with the Undersecretary of the Department of Navy, and ultimately in a panel at one time involving some admirals and generals and lawyers from the Department of the Navy, and then ultimately sat before the Undersecretary and the Secretary of the Navy for a final interview. And they asked me to step out of the office. I thought, okay, well, they're just trying to figure out how to say thanks, but no thanks. And Secretary Mavis called me back into the office, and he said, and I actually didn't say anything. He reached across the desk, shook my hand. I thought, again, he's going to say, thanks for
applying, right?
Yeah. And he said, congratulations, you're the new director. And I thought my heart about stopped.
I bet.
Because when you start out as a young agent, you just can't imagine.
That no one considers themselves
Taking-
quality, capable of that.
No, and Jeff, I was so proud of being just being an agent and working in such a fine organization for that many years that I couldn't imagine running the organization. But fortunately, God blessed me with a fabulous staff and guidance. And in the next 3 years, little over 3 years, I served as the director. Was just an absolute highlight of my career. I loved every minute of it. It was a great organization, and it still is.
Yeah. I want to say to the listener, although I've never seen an episode of NCIS, this show would have never got off the ground if it isn't for the reputation of NCIS. And that reputation comes with just countless agents doing honest, hard work every day, countless, professionals doing hard work every day. You'll notice that there are other organizations like it that don't have a television show, let alone multiple spin-off versions of the television show. And it's because of the reputation. Even I, though I'm an Army guy, am aware of the reputation of NCIS. And it's because of the amazing professionals that work there. The fact that you were able to lead that organization as the director for a couple of years, I can only imagine what that honor must have felt like.
It was a huge honor, Jeff. Yes, and thank you for those kind words.
No, I'm serious.
Great people.
That show, what I'm trying to say to the listener right now is that television show never gets off the ground if NCIS doesn't have the reputation in the U.S. military that it has, let alone in the country. And you don't have other organizations in the military with television shows like that. So it deserves the attention that it's getting on television. Which takes me to this. I got to know, what did this feel like when they said, hey, Mark, you want to play yourself on television? Because I have an actor who plays me on TV, but nobody was crazy enough to ask me to play a television or play a movie role. I mean, I have an actor who plays me in the movie. Nobody was crazy enough to ask Jeff to do that. So tell me what that must have been like.
No, it was a huge honor. And it actually is something that they have offered to each of our civilian directors.
Really?
My predecessors and those who followed me, as a courtesy, I guess.
That's cool.
I got to give a shout out to the producers and the directors and the writers and so forth. They do a phenomenal job of representing us well, and I thank them for that. And it was an awesome experience. They made it a lot of fun for me to go out there. They did the whole thing from makeup to practicing my lines, although they were too short lines. And
they said, give him just a couple of lines. That way we don't have to put him, that way he doesn't have to memorize an entire script.
Yes, make it easy on this guy. Yeah. He's old, So, and they actually made a custom-made suit for me.
Oh, this is awesome.
I thought for sure, well, when it's all done, you're going to give me the suit. I mean, it was tailor-made. Literally that day, it was tailor-made for me. And I said, so do I get to keep the suit? And they said, oh, no, we'll break it down and we'll rebuild other suits out of it.
Wow. I thought they were going to say that's going to go into the Hollywood archives somewhere. That'll be behind glass one day.
But my acting skills when you realize that I was never invited back. So.
Yeah. Well, listen, I know this, you know this. Television shows and major motion pictures are built to make money. They're not necessarily out there to educate the audience, though television shows like NCIS have done that really, really well. But it says something about the producers of this show that they want to put you on the show. I mean, they don't have to do that. And the fact that they will do that for you says a lot about the heart of those producers and directors. I think this is really, really cool. And I mean this in all sincerity because there's nothing, motivating them to do this other than they've just got a good heart.
They do have a good heart. And if I could share just another quick story on that.
Of course.
We, as you know, we have to deploy our agents with the
Yeah.
military wherever they go. And
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes it's over holidays and special events and so forth that they're separated from their families. And oftentimes the actors will pen special notes in their own handwriting, takes to send that off to our agents who are forward deployed over Christmas or during holidays, otherwise 4th of July, you name it, but they've been separated from the family. And it's just a few words of encouragement. And I think that speaks volumes to the character of the actors and those who are responsible for
Wow. Okay, so for all of the listeners out there that are dying to hear it, when they watch NCIS, obviously there's not that many murders that you're investigating, but the spirit behind the TV shows, are they pretty accurate?
Yes. Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean
absolutely.
that's the question that I get asked repeatedly about Black Hawk Down, and I say the same thing. Like, look, the movie was designed to make money, but the spirit behind it, I don't know that you could have done it any better in a major motion picture format than the way that they portrayed Black Hawk Down. And I'm glad to hear that's the case with the folks, the team behind the NCIS franchises.
Yeah, you see the combination of passion for the mission and uh, the familiarity and the appreciation for each other.
Yeah,
If
the
you brother,
camaraderie.
if you will. Yeah,
Yeah. Passion and camaraderie, true of all of the military professionals in our country. Um, Listen, you transition out of the military and now you're working for the International Justice Mission. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing today?
sure. So I worked for the International Justice Mission for about 5 years. I was the vice president for investigations and law enforcement development. Great mix for what I was doing. For those that don't know, IJM, the International Justice Mission, is responsible for rescuing slaves. It's a Christian
Yeah,
nonprofit.
I'm sorry to interrupt. It is an amazing organization that is involved all over the world in some of the ugliest evil on this planet.
Correct. And that inspired me and a colleague to, once we left IJM, to create our own nonprofit called Prevention Now. For anybody that wants to visit that, it's prevention-now.org, where we try to prevent human trafficking. And much using a lot of the technique that we use to protect the Department of the Navy from terror attacks.
This is awesome. Mark, I have had several amazing warriors on this podcast who, after transitioning out of the military, they said, I'm going to do some good with my skill set. And many of them focused it on human trafficking and on sex slaves. And they're now doing similar to what you're doing. It does my heart good to see people with the kind of competence and skills that you have using it to try to rescue people and to try to, in your case, prevent it, not just rescue them once they're caught up in that lifestyle. Man, this is awesome. I hope that there are some listeners out there that are saying, I want to know more about Prevention Now. I want to know how I can partner with Prevention Now. So you talked about the website, but if there's some people that are listening that say, I want to do more than just, read about it, how should they learn more about what you guys are doing?
Yeah, be aware of those around you. I can tell you with absolute certainty that human trafficking and child exploitation takes place in every single county in this country and every country that I've ever been in. It is real. It is incredibly dark, and you just need to be sensitive to be able to recognize it when you see it. It's there. And so we do a lot of training with law enforcement agencies and first responders, school teachers. I've spoken to church groups and so forth. Um, and primarily, the greatest good the public can do is just be sensitive to the fact that it is in your community. And the more we're aware of it, the better capable we'll be to fight it and prevent it.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you're saying this because this podcast goes out around the world, but this is now everywhere. There's no one that can say, "Hey, that might have happened. That might be happening in other people's countries or in their communities, but it's not happening in mine." It is now everywhere. It's tragic how this has skyrocketed in the last 15, 20 years. And so I hope that everyone listening will uh, check out Prevention Now and just start to become more aware and more sensitive about what might be happening literally just down the street from you.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for that, Jeff.
Mark, there is a lot more that I would like to be able to ask you about, but I just want to say, of all of the guests that I've had on this show, your commitment to our country, your willingness to be in the right place at the right time, and to lead people well. You are the perfect guest for this show, not just because you're in the building of the Pentagon during September 11th, but because of all that you've done, but also because of your faith and how it's propelling you to continue to try to make a difference. So thank you, Mark, for being my final guest on Unbeatable. This episode hasn't disappointed me.
Well, thank you, Jeff. And thank you for all you've done. And thank you for your courageous service to our country.
Yeah, it was great talking to you, and I hope we'll stay in touch.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
That was it, guys. This is the end of the final episode of the Unbeatable Podcast. But again, I want to ask you, would you please go ahead and download the Jeff Struecker Ministries mobile app? Just go to the Apple App Store or Google Play and type in Jeff Struecker Ministries and you will find that app. Would you go ahead and subscribe if you're already using Apple TV or Amazon Fire or Roku? Why don't you go ahead and subscribe to the Jeff Struecker television channel, because I'm going to start delivering content each week directly to the TV channel, directly to the mobile app. That way you don't have to search for me. If you're already connected with me on social media, on the Jeff Struecker social media channels, those channels will all continue and I'll continue to deliver content there. If you're following and subscribing to the Unbeatable Podcast channels, we'll start transitioning those channels to the Jeff Struecker Ministries content. But normally, this is the time of the episode where I introduce a fan of the week. And I really want to say, I would not have started this podcast. I would not have spent this much of my own time, this much of my own money delivering content and guests to you if it wasn't for how amazing the audience of this podcast is. Man, the kind of content that you've sent me, the encouraging words that I've heard, the feedback that I've got from you has been the reason why I have been willing to spend a great deal of my personal life savings and a lot of my personal time over the last 3 years to bring you this podcast. And I hope that you'll stay connected. I really hope that you'll download the mobile app or that you will subscribe to the television channel on one of those 3 platforms. But if you're not able to do that because of technology reasons, at a minimum, would you just stay connected through the Unbeatable Army? Just stay connected to us by going to unbeatablearmy.com. If you want to know more about Mark's organization, Prevention Now, you can see the link right there in the notes to this episode. But as I bring this episode to a close, I want to say it one more time. Thank you to all of the faithful audience. This podcast would not exist today if it wasn't for you. And I hope you've heard something over the last 3 years that has touched you at the soul level. If that's happened, then I will consider what we've done over the last 3 years a huge success. Thanks for being part of this amazing audience. And I'll see you on television or the mobile app. God bless.
These stories of triumph over adversity will help you handle your toughest days in life and become unbeatable.